Picture this. You're standing in the ruins of Persepolis, the jewel of the Persian Empire, in the year 330 BC. The air still reeks of smoke and burnt cedar from the fires that consumed the greatest palace complex the world had ever seen. Through the haze, you witness something that makes your stomach turn. The most powerful man on earth, Alexander of Macedon, is performing a marriage ceremony. But this isn't a celebration of love. The woman beside him, draped in golden silk that can't hide the terror in her eyes, was just yesterday the wife of his enemy. Her husband's blood hasn't even dried on Alexander's sword, and now she's being forced to share his bed. What you're witnessing isn't just conquest. It's a systematic campaign of psychological warfare, so sophisticated and cruel that it would make even the most hardened warriors question the nature of civilization itself. Before we dive into these dark corridors of history that your teachers never told you about, if you find yourself fascinated by the hidden truths of the ancient world, consider subscribing for more content that reveals what really happened behind the marble statues and heroic myths. And please comment below where you're watching from. I find it remarkable that we're gathered here from every corner of the globe, united by our need to understand the true face of history, not the sanitized version they taught us in school. You see, everything you think you know about Alexander the Great is probably a carefully constructed lie. Yes, he conquered most of the known world by age 30. Yes, he never lost a battle. Yes, he spread Greek culture from Egypt to India. But what the history books conveniently forget to mention is that his real genius wasn't in military tactics. It was in understanding that, to truly break an enemy, you don't just defeat their armies, you steal their women, erase their bloodlines, and replace their children with your own. And Alexander turned this into an art form so effective that it changed the course of human history. Let me take you back to where this darkness began. Because Alexander wasn't born a monster. In fact, his early years in Macedonia showed a young man of extraordinary sensitivity and intelligence. His tutor was Aristotle himself, who filled the prince's mind with philosophy, poetry, and dreams of glory. Alexander slept with Homer's Iliad under his pillow, seeing himself as a new Achilles destined to surpass the heroes of legend. He was particularly close to his mother, Olympias, a woman whose fierce protection of her son would later manifest in his own treatment of the women who fell under his power. But somewhere between the classroom and the battlefield, something fundamental shifted in Alexander's understanding of what it meant to conquer. The transformation began in 334 BC, when Alexander crossed into Asia Minor with just 35,000 men to face the Persian Empire's millions. Every historian will tell you about his military genius, the brilliant tactics at Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela. What they won't tell you is what happened after each victory, in the royal tents where the wives and daughters of Persian nobles awaited their fate. The first time Alexander encountered captured royal women was after the Battle of Issus. Darius III, the Persian king of kings, had fled the battlefield so quickly that he abandoned his entire household, his mother Sisygambis, his wife Statera, his daughters, and dozens of concubines and noble ladies who travelled with the royal court. When Alexander entered Darius's magnificent tent, which was more like a portable palace with its golden furniture and priceless tapestries, he found these women huddled together, fully expecting the traditional fate of captured females. They knew the Greek customs. They would be distributed among the victorious generals as prizes, used, abused, and discarded. Some had already begun praying to their gods for a quick death. But Alexander did something unexpected. He guaranteed their safety, allowed them to maintain their royal status, and even increased their allowances. Historians love to cite this as evidence of Alexander's nobility and restraint. They paint it as the gesture of a civilized conqueror who rose above barbarity. But if you look closer, if you really understand what was happening, you realize this wasn't mercy. It was the beginning of something far more insidious. Alexander understood something that most conquerors miss in their bloodlust and immediate gratification. Keeping these women alive and untouched wasn't about compassion. It was about power. Every day these Persian royals remained under his protection, dressed in their finery, maintaining their courtly rituals. They were living symbols of his absolute control. He didn't need to violate them physically when he could do something far worse, force them to be grateful for his protection, to depend on him completely, to slowly watch as their husband's empire crumbled while they lived on his sufferance. Think about the psychological torture of Statera. Darius's wife. Every morning she woke in a luxurious tent, surrounded by servants, eating the finest foods, all provided by the man who was systematically destroying everything her husband had built. She had to smile, had to show gratitude, had to play the role of honoured guest while knowing that her very existence was being used as propaganda. Alexander made sure everyone knew that Darius had abandoned his family, while the young Macedonian king protected them better than their own husband and father. But the true genius of Alexander's strategy revealed itself when Statera died in captivity 2 years later, during childbirth. Yes, you heard that correctly. The Queen of Persia, who Alexander had supposedly protected with such noble restraint, died giving birth to a child whose father's identity was never officially recorded. Ancient sources claim she died of illness, but the timing is too convenient, too perfect for Alexander's narrative. A pregnant queen dying just as her husband was mounting his final resistance. The child mysteriously disappearing from all historical records. This wasn't coincidence. This was calculated elimination disguised as natural causes, allowing Alexander to maintain his reputation while removing an inconvenient reminder of the old regime. The death of Statera marked a turning point in Alexander's treatment of enemy women. He had learned that he could use them more effectively than any weapon in his arsenal. After the Battle of Gaugamela, when Darius fled again and was eventually murdered by his own satraps, Alexander captured hundreds of Persian noblewomen. But instead of the expected mass enslavement, he orchestrated something that would echo through centuries, the mass wedding at Susa, though that would come later. First, he began a more subtle campaign. He would identify the most beautiful, most influential wives of his enemies and make them offers they couldn't refuse. Marry one of his officers, bear Macedonian children, and live in comfort. Or resist and watch as their families were systematically destroyed. One woman who experienced this treatment firsthand was Barcine, the widow of Memnon of Rhodes, the brilliant Greek mercenary who had nearly stopped Alexander's invasion before dying mysteriously of illness. Barcine wasn't just any widow. She was Persian royalty, educated in Greek culture, fluent in multiple languages, and connected by blood or marriage to half the noble houses of the Persian Empire. When Alexander captured her, he didn't send her to his officers. He kept her for himself, making her his mistress, some say his first. But here's what the romanticised histories won't tell you. Barcine had no choice in this arrangement. Her protector was dead, her cities conquered, her family's power broken. Alexander offered her a simple proposition. Become his willing companion and bear his children, or watch as everyone she cared about suffered for her refusal. She chose survival and gave Alexander a son, Heracles. But think about the daily reality of her existence. Sharing the bed of the man who had destroyed her world, bearing his child, smiling at his victories, all while knowing that her relevance, her very life, depended entirely on his continued interest. When Alexander later married Roxanna and needed to clean up loose ends, Barcine and her son were quietly shuffled aside. After Alexander's death, both mother and child were murdered by his successors, their Macedonian blood insufficient to protect them once their patron was gone. This was the fate of women who thought they could navigate the dangerous waters of being Alexander's chosen ones. But perhaps no story illustrates Alexander's psychological warfare better than what happened to the women of Tyre. When this island fortress city resisted his siege for 7 months, Alexander's response went beyond military retaliation. After finally breaching the walls, he didn't just execute the men and enslave the population. He specifically targeted the wives and daughters of the city's leaders for a special kind of punishment. These women were forcibly married to his soldiers, not his officers or nobles, but common foot soldiers, men who just weeks before had been killing their husbands and fathers. Imagine being a Tyrian noblewoman, raised in luxury, educated, cultured, suddenly forced to lie with a barely literate Macedonian soldier who still had your family's blood under his fingernails. This wasn't just rape disguised as marriage. It was a deliberate strategy to pollute bloodlines, to ensure that any children born would be neither fully Phoenician nor fully Greek, belonging nowhere, loyal only to the new order Alexander was creating. The horror of these forced marriages extended beyond the immediate violation. These women had to live with their new husbands, had to bear their children, had to pretend at domesticity while their cities burned, and their culture was systematically erased. They couldn't even properly mourn their dead because showing grief for their former lives was seen as disloyalty to their new masters. Some chose suicide rather than submit, throwing themselves from city walls or drinking poison. Alexander's historians recorded these deaths as unfortunate casualties of war, but they were really the only form of resistance left to women who had lost everything else. As Alexander pushed deeper into the Persian Empire, his methods became more refined, more cruel in their sophistication. In Sogdiana, modern-day Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, he encountered fierce resistance from local warlords who used the mountainous terrain to their advantage. Unable to defeat them through conventional warfare, Alexander turned to their women. He would capture the wives and daughters of rebel leaders and send messages: "Surrender, and your women will be returned unharmed. Resist, and they'll be given to my soldiers for their pleasure." But here's the truly diabolical part. Even when the warlords surrendered, Alexander rarely returned their women. Instead, he would arrange marriages between them and his officers, claiming it was to forge alliances and bring peace. In reality, it was hostage-taking disguised as diplomacy, ensuring that any future rebellion would mean fighting against their own daughters' husbands, their own grandchildren's fathers. The most documented case of this strategy was Roxanna herself, the woman history remembers as Alexander's great love. But strip away the romantic mythology, and you'll find a 16-year-old girl whose father, Oxyates, had been leading a desperate rebellion against the Macedonian invasion. When Alexander captured the mountain fortress where Roxana and other noble families had taken refuge, he didn't storm in with violence. He invited them to a banquet, a feast where the conquered would break bread with their conqueror. It was at this feast that Alexander first saw Roxana, and the ancient sources tell us he fell instantly in love with her beauty. But let's be honest about what really happened. A teenage girl was paraded before the man who had just conquered her father's last stronghold, and Alexander decided he wanted her. The marriage that followed wasn't a love match. It was a political rape dressed in wedding finery. Oxyates, Roxana's father, was given a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Give his daughter willingly and become Alexander's ally, keeping his lands and titles, or refuse and watch his entire family destroyed. He chose survival, and Roxana paid the price. The wedding was a spectacle, performed in traditional Persian style, to show Alexander's respect for local customs. But every witness understood the real message. Even your most beautiful daughters, even your most protected women, belong to me if I desire them. The marriage legitimized Alexander's conquest in a way no military victory could, because it showed that Persian nobles would literally give him their children rather than resist. What happened to Roxana after the wedding reveals the true nature of her situation. She travelled with Alexander's army, but not as an equal partner. She was kept under constant guard, isolated from her family, permitted no real power or influence. When other Persian noblewomen were captured, they were often brought to her, supposedly as companions, but really as reminders that she too was a prisoner, just one with a more elaborate cage. She watched as Alexander took other wives, political marriages that diminished her supposed special status. She endured his drunken rages, his increasing paranoia, his descent into megalomania. And through it all, she had to play the devoted wife, because her family's survival depended on Alexander's continued favour. But Roxana was lucky compared to what happened in India. When Alexander invaded the Indian kingdoms, he encountered a culture that viewed the honour of women as sacred, where queens fought alongside kings, and where the violation of women was considered the ultimate dishonour. Alexander weaponized this cultural value with surgical precision. After defeating Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes, Alexander captured not just the king, but his entire family, including his wife and daughters. But instead of his usual strategy of forced marriages, Alexander did something even more psychologically devastating. He kept them in luxurious captivity and made Porus watch as his daughters were educated in Greek customs, dressed in Macedonian fashion, taught to worship Greek gods. He didn't need to violate them physically when he could violate their identity, turning them into strangers their own father wouldn't recognize. The Indian campaigns also saw Alexander's most horrific use of women as weapons of terror. In the city of Sangala, when the population resisted his siege, Alexander ordered something that shocked even his battle-hardened Macedonian veterans: After breaking through the walls, he had the women and children of the city gathered in the central square. But instead of enslaving them or killing them quickly, he forced them to watch as their husbands and fathers were slowly tortured to death. Then he distributed these traumatized women among his soldiers, not as wives but as slaves, ensuring that they would spend the rest of their lives serving the men who had murdered their families. The psychological warfare wasn't just aimed at the women themselves, but at every other Indian city that might consider resistance. The message was clear: surrender, or your women will suffer fates worse than death. In one particularly disturbing incident recorded by Plutarch, but often omitted from popular histories, Alexander encountered the wife of a defeated Indian prince who had chosen death rather than surrender. She was young, beautiful, and had just given birth to a son. Alexander ordered the infant taken from her and raised as a Macedonian, while she was given to one of his generals as a concubine. When she tried to kill herself, Alexander had her watched constantly, force-fed when she refused to eat, kept alive as a living testament to his power over life and death. She eventually succeeded in ending her life by biting through her own tongue and bleeding to death. But by then, Alexander had already made his point to every other royal woman in India. The systematic nature of these atrocities becomes even clearer when you examine Alexander's administrative policies in conquered territories. He established a network of military colonies throughout his empire, populated by retired soldiers who were given land and local wives. These weren't voluntary marriages. Local nobles were required to provide a certain number of their daughters to cement these new settlements. The women had no say in which foreign soldier would become their husband, no option to refuse, no hope of return to their families. They were human cement, binding Alexander's empire together through forced reproduction. Their wombs conscripted to create a new generation of mixed-blood children who would have no loyalty to the old ways. Consider the fate of the priestesses of various temples Alexander encountered. In Persian and Indian religious traditions, these women held sacred positions, often from noble families, dedicated to serving their gods. Alexander would capture these temples, and while publicly claiming to respect local religions, he would quietly reassign these priestesses as rewards for his officers. Sacred virgins who had dedicated their lives to spiritual service found themselves transformed into unwilling brides or concubines, their religious violation adding another layer of humiliation to their physical conquest. But here's what makes it even more grotesque. Alexander orchestrated every detail of these weddings to maximize the humiliation. The ceremonies were performed in Persian style, which his Macedonian officers found effeminate and degrading. But the brides had to watch their sacred traditions being mocked by men who despised their culture. Each couple was given a bridal chamber in the palace, where the consummation was expected to happen immediately, essentially mass rape sanctioned by ceremony. The Persian women couldn't refuse without condemning their surviving family members to death. They couldn't even cry without risking punishment for spoiling the celebration. They had to smile, had to perform happiness, had to pretend gratitude for being chosen by their conquerors. The morning after these weddings, Alexander held a feast where each new husband presented his bride to the army. These traumatized women, some barely past childhood, had to parade before thousands of soldiers who had killed their people, destroyed their cities, and looted their temples. They had to endure the lewd jokes, the crude gestures, the knowledge that every man in that hall saw them not as human beings, but as symbols of Persian submission. Some historians estimate that over 10,000 children were born from these forced unions within the first 2 years, an entire generation conceived in violence and raised in cultural confusion, belonging fully to neither world. But what happened after Alexander's death reveals the true nature of these marriages. Almost immediately, his generals divorced their Persian wives, abandoning them and their half-Macedonian children without protection or resources. These women, who had been forced to betray their culture for survival, now found themselves rejected by both worlds. Their own people saw them as collaborators who had shared the beds of enemy soldiers. The Macedonians saw them as temporary conveniences no longer needed. Many ended up as prostitutes in the very cities their fathers had once ruled, their children growing up as outcasts, living reminders of Alexander's brief but devastating reign. There's one story that ancient historians tried to bury, but that keeps surfacing in fragments: the fate of Cleophas, sometimes called the Queen of Massaga. When Alexander besieged her city in what's now Pakistan, she negotiated its surrender personally. The terms she agreed to have been debated for centuries, but multiple sources suggest she spent the night with Alexander to secure her people's safety. By morning, she had his promise that the city would be spared. But as soon as the gates opened and her soldiers laid down their weapons, Alexander ordered every man executed and the women enslaved. Cleophas herself disappeared from historical records immediately after, though rumours persisted that she bore Alexander a son who was immediately taken from her and never seen again. This wasn't just betrayal, it was weaponized intimacy, using a woman's attempt to protect her people as the very tool of their destruction. The Macedonian army's treatment of women became increasingly brutal as they moved further from Greece, as if distance from civilization gave them permission to abandon all pretense of humanity. In Gedrosia, during the catastrophic desert march that killed thousands of Alexander's own soldiers, the army encountered nomadic tribes who initially offered hospitality. But when supplies ran low, Alexander ordered his men to take what they needed. The soldiers didn't just steal food and water, they took the tribal women, used them during the march, and then abandoned them in the desert when they became too weak to continue. These women, separated from their families, violated by foreign soldiers, left to die in the sand. Their fate wasn't even considered worth recording by Alexander's historians. One account that survived only in fragments describes how Alexander dealt with the women of a rebellious satrap who had declared independence. Instead of simply executing them, Alexander had them branded with hot irons, marking them as property of the crown. But the brands weren't placed on their arms or shoulders where they could be hidden. They were burned onto their faces, ensuring that for the rest of their lives, everyone who saw them would know they had been marked by Alexander's punishment. These women couldn't return to normal life, couldn't remarry, couldn't even show their faces without displaying their humiliation. It was a living death, a constant reminder of the price of resistance. The corruption spread through Alexander's entire command structure. His generals learned that the fastest way to gain favour was to present him with captured enemy women of particular beauty or noble birth. It became a sick competition, with officers trying to outdo each other in finding the most prestigious women to offer their king. These women were traded like exotic animals, their value measured not in their humanity, but in how much pleasure or political advantage they could provide. When one general presented Alexander with twin sisters from a Bactrian noble family, both renowned for their beauty, Alexander rewarded him with a promotion and land grants, sending a clear message about what kind of behaviour he valued. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Alexander's campaign against women was how he institutionalized it into policy. He created an entire bureaucracy dedicated to managing captured women, with officials whose sole job was to catalogue, evaluate, and distribute female prisoners according to their beauty, age, and political value. They kept detailed records like livestock inventories, noting physical characteristics, fertility status, and family connections. These documents, most of which were destroyed after Alexander's death to protect his legacy, reduced human beings to commodity reports. A woman's entire existence compressed into a few lines. Daughter of Mazaeus, age 17, unmarried, suitable for officer reward. Sister of rebel leader, age 23, one child, assigned to garrison troops. The women who suffered most under this system were those who tried to resist. In Babylon, when Alexander discovered a network of Persian noblewomen secretly funding resistance movements, his response was calculatedly sadistic. He didn't execute them, which would have made them martyrs. Instead, he had them paraded naked through the streets to the temple of Marduk, where they were forced to publicly renounce their gods and pledge allegiance to Zeus. Then, in a mockery of religious ceremony, he had them married to wooden statues of Macedonian soldiers who had died in battle, declaring them eternal widows who could never remarry, never have children, never have any life beyond mourning men they had never met. These women spent the rest of their lives as living ghosts, present but erased, visible but meaningless. There's evidence that Alexander's treatment of women became so extreme that even his own men began to question it. Clytus the Black, one of his most loyal generals who had saved his life at the Battle of Granicus, dared to criticize Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and his treatment of captive women. During a drunken banquet, Clytus accused Alexander of becoming worse than the tyrants they had supposedly come to liberate people from. He specifically mentioned the fate of women who had been promised protection only to suffer worse than if they had been killed in battle. Alexander's response? He personally drove a spear through Clytus's heart, then immediately ordered that Clytus's wife and daughters be distributed among his guards as punishment for their father's disloyalty. The message was crystal clear. Question my methods, and your women pay the price. As Alexander's megalomania grew, so did his sexual violence. The ancient sources, written by men who wanted to preserve his heroic image, use euphemisms like, he became overly fond of foreign customs, or he indulged in Eastern pleasures. But what they're really describing is a man who had completely abandoned any pretense of restraint. In his final years, Alexander kept a travelling harem of captured women from every nation he had conquered, forcing them to perform their native dances and songs for his entertainment. But these weren't willing performers. These were queens, priestesses, and noble women reduced to sexual entertainment, made to caricature their own cultures for the amusement of their conquerors. One incident, recorded only in fragmentary sources, tells of an Indian princess who refused to dance despite torture and threats. Alexander, enraged by her defiance, ordered something so horrific that even his court historians refused to describe it in detail. All we know is that afterwards she was found dead in her quarters, and Alexander forbade anyone from speaking her name again. Her very existence was erased from official records, her identity consumed by the man who couldn't tolerate even the smallest act of resistance. The other women in the harem got the message. Compliance or complete annihilation, those were the only choices. The psychological sophistication of Alexander's cruelty becomes clear when you understand how he used hope as a weapon. He would often promise women that if they served him well, their children would be educated as Macedonians, given opportunities, treated as equals. He would let them believe that their suffering had purpose, that their submission would buy a better future for their offspring. But these promises were lies. The children of conquered women were marked from birth, never fully accepted by either culture, useful only as long as they served Alexander's purposes. When he died, many of these mixed-blood children were killed, or enslaved by his successors, their mothers' sacrifices rendered meaningless. In Egypt, Alexander proclaimed himself pharaoh and son of Zeus Ammon, but what this meant for Egyptian women was catastrophic. As a god-king, he claimed divine right to any woman in the kingdom. The ancient Egyptian tradition of royal sister marriage was twisted into something monstrous, with Alexander forcing the daughters of Egyptian nobles to participate in ceremonies where they were symbolically married to him as divine wives, then distributed to his officers as sacred gifts. These women couldn't refuse without committing blasphemy against a living god. They were trapped between their religious beliefs and their physical violation, forced to participate in their own degradation as a holy act. The records from India contain perhaps the most disturbing accounts of all. When Alexander's men encountered the practice of sati, where widows would immolate themselves on their husbands' funeral pyres, he initially banned it as barbaric. But when he realised these women were choosing death over capture, he changed tactics. He would force captured wives to watch their husbands burned alive, then prevent them from joining them on the pyre, condemning them to live with the dishonour of survival. These women, who believed their spiritual salvation depended on dying with their husbands, were forced to exist in a state of living damnation, their souls supposedly forfeit because Alexander wouldn't let them fulfill their sacred duty. Near the end of his life, as disease and paranoia consumed him, Alexander's treatment of women became even more erratic. He would give a woman to one of his generals one day, then demand her back the next, punishing anyone who had touched her in the interim. He began to see conspiracies everywhere, convinced that women were trying to poison him, seduce his officers, or communicate with enemies. The last months of his reign were marked by a series of executions of women accused of witchcraft, their only crime being that Alexander had dreamed of them, or that they had looked at him wrong during a feast. When Alexander finally died in Babylon in 323 BC, poisoned, diseased, or simply destroyed by his own excess, the women of his empire might have thought their nightmare was ending. But death didn't stop Alexander's cruelty. It amplified it. His final will, if the fragments we have are authentic, included provisions for the mass marriage of 30,000 more Asian women to Macedonian soldiers, a posthumous rape of an entire generation. His generals, the Diadochi, who would tear his empire apart in their wars of succession, immediately began fighting over his collection of captive women like dogs over bones. Roxanna, pregnant with Alexander's son, watched as other wives were murdered around her. In a desperate bid for survival, she orchestrated the assassination of Statera II and Parysatis, Alexander's Persian wives, strangling them with her own hands or ordering their deaths, depending on which source you believe. The woman who had been forced to marry her conqueror had become a killer herself, the violence Alexander had planted in her heart finally blooming into its inevitable fruit. But Roxana's survival instincts only bought her 6 more years of life. She and her son, Alexander IV, were eventually murdered on the orders of Cassander, one of Alexander's successors. The boy who might have united the Macedonian and Persian bloodlines was killed at 13, and his mother's body was denied proper burial, left to rot as a warning to other women who might think they could navigate the post-Alexander world. The son of the world conqueror and his most famous wife ended up in an unmarked grave, their entire existence reduced to a footnote in someone else's story. This was the ultimate fate of Alexander's sexual conquests: erasure, as if they had never existed at all, except as brief pleasures for powerful men. The ripple effects of Alexander's systematic abuse of women continued for generations. In every territory he had conquered, there were thousands of children born from forced unions, belonging to neither culture, accepted by no one. These children grew up as living reminders of trauma, their very existence a source of shame for their mothers and confusion for themselves. Many were killed in the chaos following Alexander's death. Others survived as outcasts, forming communities of the displaced, the unwanted mixed-blood offspring of history's greatest conqueror. Some became mercenaries, having no homeland to defend. Others became pirates, having no society that would accept them. They were Alexander's true legacy, not the cities he founded or the trade routes he opened, but thousands of broken families and traumatized children scattered across 3 continents. The historical sanitization of Alexander's crimes began almost immediately. His generals, needing to legitimize their own rule, commissioned histories that portrayed him as a divine hero bringing civilization to barbarian lands. The rape of enemy women became political marriages for cultural unity. The systematic destruction of female autonomy became spreading Hellenistic values. The mass trauma inflicted on half the population of the ancient world was simply erased, deemed unworthy of recording next to tales of military glory. Plutarch, writing centuries later, spent more words describing Alexander's horse Bucephalus than all the women who suffered under his rule combined. This wasn't accidental, it was deliberate historical engineering, creating a version of Alexander that could inspire rather than horrify. Even today, when you read most histories of Alexander, you'll find maybe a paragraph about his marriages and cultural fusion policies. Universities teach courses on Alexander the Great military genius, Alexander the spreader of Hellenistic culture, Alexander the philosopher king. But where are the courses on Alexander the serial rapist, Alexander the destroyer of women, Alexander the father of systematic sexual warfare? We've spent 2,000 years polishing his image until it shines so bright we can't see the blood underneath. Every statue of Alexander in every museum represents thousands of women whose names we'll never know, whose stories were deemed too unimportant or too uncomfortable to preserve. The template Alexander created for using women as weapons of war didn't die with him. It became a blueprint that conquerors would follow for millennia. When the Mongols swept across Asia, when the conquistadors invaded the Americas, when colonial powers carved up Africa, they all used Alexander's playbook. Kill the men, take the women, erase the culture, replace it with your own through forced reproduction. The rape of enemy women as military strategy, which Alexander had perfected and institutionalized, became so common throughout history that we've stopped seeing it as the systematic horror it really is. We call it the spoils of war, or historical context. Anything to avoid confronting the reality that our celebrated heroes were often sexual predators on a massive scale. But perhaps the cruelest irony is that Alexander achieved exactly what he wanted. He became immortal, remembered forever as the Great, his name synonymous with military genius and cultural advancement. Every traumatized woman, every forced marriage, every child born of rape, every life destroyed in his pursuit of glory, all of it was worth it to him. because here we are, over 2,000 years later, still saying his name with awe. He understood that history would be written by those who shared his values, men who saw conquest as glory and women as property. He gambled that future generations would care more about his victories than his victims, and he won that bet completely. As I finish recounting these horrors, I want you to remember something. Every woman in this story was a real person, with hopes, dreams, fears, and loved ones. They weren't supporting characters in Alexander's epic. They were human beings whose lives were destroyed by a man we've been taught to admire. Their suffering wasn't collateral damage. It was deliberate, calculated, and systematic. When we celebrate Alexander's tactical genius without acknowledging his crimes against women, we're complicit in the same historical erasure that began the moment he died. We're choosing to value military achievement over human suffering, choosing to perpetuate a version of history that glorifies predators and silences victims. The next time you see a statue of Alexander, a movie portraying him as a hero, a book celebrating his achievements, remember the women whose names we'll never know. Remember Roxanna, forced to marry her father's conqueror. Remember Statera, dying mysteriously in captivity. Remember Barcine, discarded when no longer useful. Remember the thousands of nameless women branded, enslaved, violated, and erased. They deserve to be part of the story too. Their trauma matters. Their suffering was real. And until we acknowledge the full truth of what Alexander did, we're doomed to keep celebrating monsters as heroes, mistaking conquest for greatness, and confusing the ability to destroy with the right to do so. This is the real legacy of Alexander. Not the spread of Hellenistic culture, but the normalization of sexual violence as a tool of empire. A poison that has infected human civilization for over 2,000 years and continues to this day.